When Red Bull purchased Minardi in 2005 and rebranded it into the ever so imaginative Toro Rosso, that's Red Bull in Italian for the less linguistic of you, the mission objective was clear. Here was a team created to deliver a fresh intake of Red Bull juniors into F1, allow them to garner some race experience and, after a short period of time, conclude whether they were the bee's knees or about as useless and slow as my own. The lucky ones got the chance to move up to Big Daddy Red Bull, and the rest discarded to the side and replaced with newer and increasingly younger models. It's a solid concept in practice, pushing aside the moral ramifications of chucking a driver out of F1 before they're even old enough to buy a pint. But it's not always as simple as that. Sometimes there's a blockage on the Red Bull conveyor belt or a deficit of drivers who are ready to either make the leap from the junior to senior operation. In situations like that, Red Bull have chosen to neatly fold up their modus operandi and instead look elsewhere. For Papa Red Bull, that's never been a problem. The likes of Mark Webber and Sergio Perez have neatly slid into a seat at the main team in lieu of any Red Bull-backed candidates, and promptly delivered points, podiums, and the odd win here and there. Problem is, those at Toro Rosso / Alpha Tauri / Hugo Boss Bull's big boys haven't enjoyed the same degree of success when following a similar recruitment method. Of course, it's a different calibre of driver they've been taking on, more often rookies than renowned drivers. But for an outfit that prides itself on picking and choosing only the finest talents in junior series, that excuse doesn't really hold up. On some occasions, former Red Bull juniors long since cast aside have been welcomed back into the fold with open arms to differing degrees of success. For every Alex Albon, you also get a Brendan Hartley. Other times they find themselves forced to recall old faces. Daniil Kvyat, for one, a man who's been bounced around motorhomes more times than a space hopper to the face of Lando Norris, or the more recent return of Daniel Ricciardo. And when just about every option vaguely related to Red Bull has dried up, they've been forced to cast their net even wider out. Nick de Vries is the most up-to-date example of this, and suffice to say, provides adequate reasoning as to why this practice has fallen out of fashion. But all the struggles of de Vries, a former F2 and Formula E champion, let's not forget, perhaps pale on the disappointment spectrum when compared to the first of those non-Red Bull juniors who graduated into F1 with Toro Rosso, a man by the name of Sebastien Bourdais. It's a name synonymous with success, particularly for those across the pond. A 4-time ChampCar champion who still ranks as one of the most successful drivers in the history of American open-wheel racing, alongside the likes of AJ Foyt, Scott Dixon and Mario Andretti. Few drivers have arrived in F1 with such a glittering CV. Few have simultaneously disappointed and underwhelmed. The tale of a driver with success in America struggling to make the transition into Formula One is as oft repeated as yet another entry into the Fast and Furious franchise. But then few others can bemoan such a dreadful run of misfortune and bad luck as Monsieur Bourdais, a man for whom, with perhaps the flick of a butterfly's wings or the flip of a coin, could have enjoyed a perfectly respectable F1 career, one not warranting a second glance over for the sake of commentary or criticism. But in this universe, such tweaks to the past never occurred, and so we're left to dive into the tale of Sebastien Bourdais and his Toro Rosso turmoils. Fittingly, Bourdais was born in one of the most iconic racing cities of motorsport, Le Mans. If that wasn't enough to immediately instill the racing bug, the essence of racing was injected directly into his veins via the racing exploits of his father Patrick, a racer of touring cars and sports cars. At 10, he received a go-kart for Christmas, and Sebastien never looked back. Armfuls upon armfuls of French championships came his way through the 90s, and soon it was on to the world of single-seater racing. From Formula Campus by Renault, he went to French Formula Renault, finishing runner-up in his sophomore year, and then continued his climb up into French Formula 3. He claimed Rookie of the Year honours in 98 and then the title in 99, adding his name to luminaries like Alain Prost, Jacques Lafille and Jean Alesi. It was after Formula 3000 as the new millennium rang in, and though he ranked 9th, he took a pole and podium on home soil, was highlighted in the Grand Prix Guide of 2001 as possessing good natural speed and being worth keeping an eye on. So everyone kept their respective peepers glued to him for 2001, and they subsequently watched as the Frenchman took another pole and then his first win in changeable conditions at Silverstone as he rose to rank 4th. 2002 brought about a three-way tussle for the title with Sebastien, Thomas Engay and Giorgio Pantano. Thanks to 6 poles, 3 wins, 1 disqualification for Engay for a failed drugs test and possibly a partridge in a pear tree, Bourdais took the championship. Seemingly everything had gone right for France's new blue-eyed boy. He was a talented 23-year-old with F3 and F3000 titles in his grasp, ready to take on the world. F1 beckoned. Or did it? Winning the Formula 3000 title had become less and less of a viable entry route into the top tier. Only one of the last 7 champions had graduated into F1 the very next year, and 3 of those 7 never even started an F1 race. Plus, there was the minor issue of just where were all the opportunities going to come from. Prost Grand Prix, once supposedly the all-blue, all-French haven for new French talent, had gone by the end of 2001. The Elf Motorsport network, once responsible for a production line of iconic French talent in the 70s and 80s, names like Prost, Pironi, Arnoux, Lafille, Sévère, that had disintegrated too. It seemed like Bourdais' F1 dreams would follow that of the likes of Jörg Müller or Bruno Junqueira, as yet another talent on the list of best drivers never to make it to F1. Luckily though, Sebastian's talents had caught someone's eye and, more importantly, someone in F1. Arrow's managing director Tom Walkinshaw, a true veteran of motorsport across the years, had liked what he'd seen from the Frenchman. He invited Bourdais to a test at Valencia in July that year. His first day testing left him slowest of all, over 3 seconds from race driver Heinz-Harald Frentzen. But with only 25 laps behind the wheel, Sebastien was merely getting used to the car. And the next day he went 2 seconds faster, completed 71 laps, and even beat Williams tester Marc Genet by a 10th. Arrows was suitably impressed, with Chief Race Engineer Graham Taylor decreeing the young gun as calm, professional, and having done a very good job. Walkinshaw wasted no time in grabbing Sebastian's signature on a bit of paper that read 2003 Arrow's F1 driver. With an imminent F1 promotion in his back pocket, it then suddenly seemed like the graduation might occur sooner than expected. Frentzen had quit Arrow shortly before the Hungarian Grand Prix. Alongside the likes of Jos Verstappen and old foe Engay, Bourdais' name was being mooted to slot into that seat. But Bourdais wouldn't get the seat, and nor would anyone else. Arrows, having grappled with financial worries for so long, ran out of money and were forced to sit out the remainder of the year and went into liquidation by the end of it. A staple of the F1 grid since 1978 was gone, and with them went Bourdais' prospective F1 seat. Another F1 test came along at the year's end, but proved just as disappointing for his prospects. To much fanfare within the French presses, Bourdais got a chance to test with the Renault, and seemingly it went reasonably well, with reports suggesting he'd lap close to the pace of regular driver Jarno Trulli. But ultimately, it led to nothing. Both Trulli and Fernando Alonso had already been signed for Renault the next year. Bourdais says that the test was merely to placate the French media, and that no one knew what I was doing there. The French Motorsport Federation were desperate to help an up-and-coming French driver into F1, but unhelpfully seemed fixated on Renault as that stepping stone. There they found the blockade of one Flavio Briatore, the shrewdest and possibly most untrustworthy figure in the West, who only offered Sebastian a testing role with no guarantees, and only then if Bourdais signed Briatore as his manager. Perhaps sensibly, Sebastian steered clear. Though the French racing authorities continued to throw francs in the direction of Flavio, resulting in another Frenchman signing up for the Renault test role, Franck Montagny, it failed to put a French driver any closer to the starting grid. Franck remained there for the next 3 years, but never came close to a race seat, notably being overlooked when Trulli was fired at the end of 2004. A bullet dodged for Bourdais, but weirdly, the beginning of a domino effect that would pay dividends down the line. With the door to F1 now closed, it was time for Plan B, and Bourdais looked to follow the well-trod route of so many others who had missed the F1 boat into the DTM. That was until Bourdais' manager, David Sears, came along with a Plan C. And the C, of course, stood for ChampCar. Reigning champions Newman Haas had a vacancy after title holder Cristiano Di Matta had moved across to F1 with Toyota. Bourdais, Ricardo Zonta and Justin Wilson were invited for a shootout for the seat, and it was the Frenchman who came out on top, joining an illustrious list of former Formula 3000 champions to have switched to America, including teammate Junqueira, Juan Pablo Montoya and Christian Fittipaldi. Team co-owner Paul Haas stated that he felt Sebastien had the ability to win many races and fight for another championship. And boy, were those feelings right. On his debut at St. Petersburg, he became the first rookie to take pole since the great mustachioed one himself, Nigel Mansell. A race winner on his fourth time out, his maiden year saw 5 poles, 3 wins and comfortable Rookie of the Year honours, en route to ranking 4th overall. And that would be the lowest he'd ever rank throughout the rest of his ChampCar adventure. 2004 brought title number 1 with Bourdais' final record of 7 wins, 10 podiums, 14 top 3 starts and an incredible race at Denver, where he went from last to first, showing the Frenchman was a deserving champion. Sebastien then cantered to title number 2 in 2005. 5 dominant wins from the last 7 races left him with an enormous advantage at the end of a year that was only blighted by more incidents with Paul Tracy than either would care to remember. A 50% win rate in 2006 saw yet another rampant run to the title, and having now recorded his 3rd consecutive championship, this marked the first time a driver had achieved such a feat in the premier class of American open-wheel motorsport since Ted Horn in 1948. And just in case anyone had any reservations about whether Sebastien was an all-time motorsport great, 2007 delivered title number 4 with a win record of 8 from 14 races. It was a case of ChampCar completed it, mate. Bourdais admitted that it might be time to do something else, maybe NASCAR, maybe something more European. Throughout his time in ChampCar, Bourdais had made it clear to Newman Haas that if F1 ever came a-knockin', then Bourdais would be opening that door. Problem was, F1 weren't even in the neighbourhood. In the 90s and early 2000s, drivers hopping across the pond was all the rage. Some, like Al Unser Jr. and Paul Tracy, debated it. Others did do it with a fair shake of success, like Jacques Villeneuve and Juan Pablo Montoya. But then you had your Michael Andretti's and Alex Zanardi's, cautionary tales for any prospective racers thinking of trying the same. As time had gone on, the American racing scene had been a less and less viable route into F1. Too many teams had had their fingers burned by drivers failing to make the adaptation from those simpler American machines to the finicky, complex F1 beasts. Even those that had made the leap successfully came with the addendum of extensive F1 knowledge from many, many miles of testing. ChampCar and IndyCar were worlds away from F1, and subsequently less and less people in F1 were monitoring the goings-on across the pond. As the years rolled by, only one other driver arrived from America, Di Matta, and even then that was more due to his Toyota links than anything else. The Brazilian was discarded after 1.5 seasons. So time ticked on and the door to F1 remained silent and shut. By 2006, Bourdais admitted he had just about given up on that dream. And then the phone rang. On the other end was Nicholas Todd, son of Ferrari boss Jean, and one of F1's increasingly prominent movers and shakers. Manager of Felipe Massa, he'd helped the Brazilian come back into F1 in 2004, and then moved him up to Ferrari just 2 years later. In the years to come, he'd managed the likes of Jules Bianchi, Charles Leclerc and Pastor Maldonado. But right now, he had another mission on his mind. France was going through a motorsport doldrum. Yes, Renault might have been on top of the world, but on the driving front, 2005 had been the first F1 grid without a French driver in 40 years. The efforts of the French Motorsport Federation had failed. Challenge accepted, thought Todd. Though Bourdais' old Renault rival Montagny had popped up for a few drives with Super Aguri in 2006, that was very much an interim role. 5 Frenchmen had participated in the GP2 series that same year, but bar a single win for Alexandre Premat, there'd be little to shout about there. So Todd had turned his eye across the pond and spotted a man with F1 ambitions, bundles of speed, and a big-name draw for a number of parties. "You're the one that I want," crooned Todd. A week later, and through his connections with Toro Rosso's engine supplier Ferrari, Todd had pushed open the doors into F1, right into Bourdais' first F1 test for 4 years at Jerez. And it went well. It was quoted at the time that it was an impressive test. The numbers backed that up, a best time of 1:21.2, faster than the current pairing of Tonio Liuzzi and Scott Speed, even with Liuzzi making some outings in a Red Bull that same test. Bourdais spoke of how quickly he became part of the team and his ease of adapting to an F1 car after so many years dabbling in a multitude of motorsport pastimes. And best of all, team owner Gerhard Berger was happy to proclaim that Bourdais had done a bloody good job and that he delivered what I had expected of him. In fact, Berger was more than happy to confirm that Sebastien was in the running for a 2008 seat. With that in mind, Bourdais openly admitted to hope for more F1 tests in the coming year. Yet the F1 promotion might have come around sooner rather than later. Heading into 2007, Toro Rosso had yet to confirm either of their drivers for the coming season. F1 Racing magazine were reporting that the Red Bull funding being funneled into the junior outfit had been slashed. With that in mind, the rumour suggested that Berger was on the prowl for a big-named X-Factor driver to lure in the biggest of bucks from sponsors. The likes of Montoya, Mika Hakkinen and Bourdais were all supposedly contacted to consider a 2007 drive. But Bourdais immediately shut down those rumours, stating there was no chance and he'd be honouring his contract with Newman Haas. "It wouldn't be right for me to say, 'Sorry, I found something better,' and walk out on them," quipped Sebastien, failing to channel his future Oscar Piastri. So 2007 rolled on by, and while Bourdais was romping to yet another title, things were beginning to move and shake in the F1 camp. After the European Grand Prix, Speed had been unceremoniously booted out of a drive, whilst Liuzzi's own seat seemed as stable as the latter stages of the Jenga World Championship. Speculation of Bourdais joining in 2008 ramped up, especially after 2 days of testing with the team at Spa. Just after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Sebastien Bourdais was announced as a Toro Rosso driver for 2008. But the arrival of the soon-to-be crowned full-time champion from across the ocean, rather than sending F1 into an excited craze, delivered a decidedly mixed reception. There was little doubt that the mathematics of 4 consecutive world titles equaled a heap of racing talent, but with the decline of ChampCar at the same time, just how strong was that ability? Was Bourdais a fantastic talent, or merely one that appeared that way from an outsider looking into a dying series? If it was the former, then why was such a dominant stateside force wasting his ability at an outfit like Toro Rosso, a team seen as backmarkers or lower midfielders at the very best? Was there a reason no other teams were clamouring for the Frenchman's signature? Others were perplexed by the choice of a total stranger to the Red Bull Junior program to not only replace their former golden child, but jump the queue ahead of all other prospective Red Bull Junior hopefuls. Then there was his age. At 29, he was no spring chicken. Indeed, in the years since Bourdais' debut, only André Lotterer, 32 on his one-off race for Caterham in 2014, has been older on their debut. Toro Rosso justified it as an experienced head to help guide the team forward after regular mishaps they had seen with the inexperienced duo of Liuzzi and Speed. But was he? Yes, he had an adaptability that was proven in his versatility in racing disciplines. In 2007 alone, he had raced champ cars, tested in F1, and drove the factory Peugeot at Le Mans. Add to that mix a history of races at iconic venues like Indianapolis, Daytona and Sebring, and a dip into the waters of other racing series like touring cars, off-road trucks and stock cars, Sebastien was arguably F1's most cosmopolitan driver. But of course, racing in F1 is a different beast entirely. Amongst those worrying for Sebastien was Toro Rosso's technical director Giorgio Ascanelli, who in his own words was extremely sceptical about the move because the cars are so different. Recounting his time engineering Michael Andretti upon his migration to F1, Ascanelli remembered telling him how he couldn't just hassle an F1 car. Cars in the USA are a bit more robust and you can have a tangle, said Giorgio. Here, collisions have to be avoided. And many others were happy to gesticulate at the cautionary tale of Andretti and Zanardi. It's clear evidence that the journey from America to F1 is an unhappy one. Then there were those across the pond questioning his decision. By all means, take on a new challenge, but why leave a dominant winning situation for the prospect of scrapping over the final points on offer? Bourdais would be departing America at the peak of his powers. How many more titles could have come his way over there? But for all his detractors, there was still a modicum of positivity surrounding Sebastien's long overdue promotion. If Bourdais was indeed the next wave of American-based talent to break the mould set by so many others, then actually Toro Rosso wasn't the worst place to ply one's trade. There was a real sense that an upward momentum was occurring in Faenza. Speed's replacement Sebastian Vettel had taken them to the dizzying heights of leading a Grand Prix in the downpours of Japan, and then followed up his misdemeanour that day with a sensational 4th place in China. 8 points last year had ranked the team 7th overall, the outfit's highest finish since 1991. And if we omit the shenanigans of the 2005 US Grand Prix, as everyone always should, it was more points than the team had scored in the last decade combined. And to counter the naysayers who questioned a drop down the competitive order, did such a move not speak of a man with a burning competitive spirit? With the ageing David Coulthard being heavily linked to retirement by the end of 2008, a solid year for an increasingly competitive outfit could well open a door into a promotion at Red Bull. All it would need was a modicum of luck. But as Albert King once warbled, if it wasn't for bad luck, I wouldn't have no luck at all. And not many other lyrics would, sadly, encompass Bourdais' 2008 season. A disappointing debut qualifying saw Bourdais out in Q1 whilst Vettel qualified in the top 10. But come race day, Vettel was out on lap 1 and Bourdais was showing off his wealth of racing experience, keeping out of trouble on a frantic day of racing. By lap 30 he'd negotiated his way into the points and was looking good to become only the second driver after Mark Webber to score points on his debut for the Faenza outfit. From 7th he rose to 6th, 5th, and then an outrageous 4th. Whilst it would be easy to gesture at the ever-growing pile of broken cars at the side of the road as the reason why, Bourdais was still ably keeping the likes of Fernando Alonso and Robert Kubica at bay. Fingers, toes, and every possible digit were crossed on the pit wall to see this dream debut come to its dream conclusion. But then, heartbreak. With 2 laps to go, Bourdais' transmission came to a grinding halt. So many cars had retired that day that he was still technically classified in 7th, still picking up points, but just the 2 instead of a possible 5. Based on that debut drive, it seemed Toro Rosso had picked well. His reliability in that chaotic opener was attributed to his experience without traction control, which had been dropped in F1 that year. Berger happily declared it a very good performance. But thereafter, Bourdais somewhat disappeared off the radar and he wouldn't trouble the point scorers again until after the summer break, when the Toro Rossos knocked it up a notch. Of the final 7 rounds, Bourdais made it into Q3 on 6 occasions, and looked primed to take full advantage of that upgrade in pace. In Belgium, he went fastest of all in Q1, eventually qualifying 9th. A fantastic start saw him vault up the order to 5th, where he comfortably ran throughout the race. But with 4 laps to go, rain began to fall. What to do? Pit for wet tyres, lose a chunk of time but gain another chunk of performance? Or stay out, save that time, jump those pitting and attempt to tiptoe around the circuit with just a few laps to go. Toro Rosso opted for the latter. Going on to the final lap, Alonso pitted and suddenly Bourdais was third, on course for his and Toro Rosso's first ever podium. He just had to survive that last lap lottery. But on dry tyres it was a monumental ask. Soon Alonso, Vettel and both BMWs all negotiated their way past Sebastien, and at the checkered flag it was only another 7th place. Cruelly, not only could it have been a podium, it could even have been 2nd place after Hamilton was later slapped with a penalty. Instead, Bourdais was left in tears in front of the media. It was so close to being a great result, I felt I could almost touch it, whimpered Sebastien. The roller coaster of highs and lows continued in Japan. Starting 9th again, a long first stint gave him 3 glorious laps in the lead of an F1 Grand Prix for the first time, and by race's end he'd finally gotten over his hoodoo of only finishing in 7th, as he took a career best 6th place. Or at least he did for around 40 minutes. Before Sebastien could even finish an episode of House, he found himself awarded with a 25-second time penalty and had been demoted to 10th. Why? Because when Bourdais had departed the pits from his second stop, the Ferrari of Felipe Massa had unceremoniously cut in front of Sebastien, which in turn caused the Toro Rosso to tap the Brazilian into a spin. If you're thinking that instant seems as unfair as the portion sizes in modern-day restaurants, you wouldn't be alone. To say there was an outroar from Bourdais' penalty would be putting it lightly. ITV's James Allen called it ridiculous and claimed that 99% of the experts he spoke to felt Bourdais was undeserving of a penalty. Plenty other media outlets labelled it as bizarre. It led to the FIA being branded Ferrari's international assistants, and accusations flew that they were merely trying to manipulate the title fight to go down to the wire. As a result of this outcry, the stewarding setup was completely reworked to become transparent, and later introduced former drivers as stewards. That was of little solace to Sebastien, who waved more points goodbye. Perhaps nowhere was Bourdais' rotten run of luck felt more than in Italy. On one of the soggiest weekends of the year, Bourdais qualified a career-best 4th. The rain carried over to the next day, and with the Toro Rossos looking like one of the fastest cars in the field that day, some big points were there for the taking. Except not. Because this is the tale of Sebastien Bourdais, a man who even the Baudelaire children would rival for a series of unfortunate events. Starting behind the safety car, Sebastien's car couldn't find first gear and subsequently stalled. Pushed back to the pits, the car finally started, but Bourdais was already a whole lap down, and that was, as they say, that. What could have been 4th or better was a lonely 18th in reality. With the second fastest race lap, little consolation. What hurt even more was the fact that the man who took pole and won that day was none other than the man sat across him in the Toro Rosso garage, one Sebastian Vettel. Whilst we may have viewed Bourdais' bad luck through the prism of a race-by-race basis, arguably there was no worse misfortune for the Frenchman that year than being partnered alongside Vettel. Alongside a Liuzzi or a Speed, Bourdais might have just held his head above the water and looked respectable. But alongside the new wunderkind, Sebastien was totally blown out of the water. The final records of the season saw Vettel outqualify Bourdais 13-4 and absolutely decimate him in the scoring columns 35-4. Even allowing for the bigger helping of points from the Monza win, Vettel had 9 point scoring finishes to Bourdais' 2. Bad luck was one thing, but being outperformed by not only a teammate, but a man 8 years your junior and one with only a handful more Grand Prix to their name was not a good look. Nor was the remainder of the season for Bourdais. Those 4 acts of misfortune account for several lost opportunities, but then what of the other 14 pointless races that same year? When retrospectively looking back on a driver's time in F1, we sometimes go race by race, taking the time to make a real deep dive into the analytics and statistics of each weekend. But in this instance, it seems almost pointless. For all of Vettel's regular point scoring and dazzling drives, Bourdais was totally anonymous at points throughout the year. Case in point were the races after his debut. 4 of the next 5 ended in retirement for the Frenchman, and it wasn't until the European Grand Prix, 11 races after Australia, that Bourdais looked remotely like scoring points again. Within that same period, Vettel had finished in the points on 4 occasions. The primary source of Bourdais' woes was the car. For starters, the new STR3 didn't roll around until the 6th race, which meant that according to Bourdais, we had a rough winter mainly because we developed the car and didn't worry too much about getting the car to my liking. Despite an uncomfortableness in the car, Sebastien was closely matched to Vettel in the opening 5 rounds, only a 2-3 deficit in qualifying and 2-1 up in races. When the new car was introduced at Monaco, the year began to unravel for the Frenchman. From that point onward, Vettel was in the points on 9 of 13 occasions, and Bourdais just the once. Even factoring better luck in Japan and Italy, still a hefty difference in performance. Bourdais described the STR3 as more pointy on entry and with a nervous rear in medium and slow corners, and a lot more understeer in the high-speed corners. Not an easy combination of factors for anyone to handle, and with those issues, was it unsurprising that Bourdais couldn't deliver? Perhaps, since Vettel had no such qualms with the car. To the glee of all the naysayers, this seemed like yet another tale of an American-based driver unable to make the switch into the more delicate F1 stallions. Certainly Giorgio Ascanelli was happy to beat that drum at year's end. He came from ChampCar, a very different universe with heavier cars and less efficient braking. You can't attack with those cars in the same way in F1. It would be good for Sebastien if that was the case. New series, new car, new struggles, exacerbated by the brilliance of your teammate. The problem for Bourdais was that he'd come with a history of switching between motorsport disciplines, a talent he'd proudly proclaimed when first queried about a switch to F1, and now that talent was nowhere to be found when he needed it most. 4 points was a paltry reward for the year. Car struggles aside, a smidgen more luck could have earned quintuple that amount. With 21 points, Bourdais could have mimicked Vettel and vaulted both the Red Bulls in the Drivers' Championship, narrowly missing out on a top 10 finish in his rookie year. An unthinkable achievement for anyone sat in a Toro Rosso or Minardi previously, until Vettel had done so. How different his standing could have been in the paddock. A renewed contract would have been a near certainty. But if is, as they say, just F1 backwards. And now many were pondering if that was the last we'd see of Sebastien Bourdais. Chief among those ponderers were Toro Rosso. Going into 2009, the order for the team was clear. 1 young gun, 1 experienced head, halt the salad please. Vettel had been promoted upstairs to Red Bull Senior. The part of young gun would now be filled by Red Bull's newest recruit just out of diapers, Sebastien Bourdais. So that left the role of experienced head to be filled, wherein Bourdais found himself at odds with a new contender, the newly available F1 refugee Takuma Sato, who came with a CV of nearly 100 starts to his name, a podium, an aggressive flair for racing, and with the additional benefit of being a marketing dream for Red Bull to tap into the Japanese market. Just after the Italian Grand Prix, Sato had tested for Toro Rosso in Jerez. Across the winter, Toro Rosso evaluated both Bourdais and Sato. They went to Barcelona and to Jerez, and on each and every occasion, Sato was faster, and even more impressively, had gone fastest of all on the first day of the Barcelona test in November. To many, it seemed like a deal with Sato was as good as done. Even the official ITV preview guide listed Sato as a Toro Rosso driver, with no hint of an asterisk that it could still be Bourdais. But on the 6th of February, Toro Rosso slammed down an Uno reverse card and announced that it was Bourdais who had been signed up for the year ahead. Team principal Franz Tost might have run through the generic re-signing spiel, stating that the team expected him to profit from the experience he gained last season, now that he knew the F1 environment, racetracks and team. But others weren't so sure, namely Sato's manager Andrew Gilbert Scott, who heavily implied that it was money that proved the deciding factor, stating the team made no secret about the fact they would need the driver to bring a substantial amount of funding. On one hand, that might make sense given how Sato had regularly outpaced Sebastien through each and every test session, but on the other, we already spoke of how the signing of Sato could impact the lucrative Japanese sector. There was no shortage of income to be garnered from what would have been a very popular signing both there and around the world. Whatever the case, Bourdais was now officially on the grid, albeit the last driver bar the two Brawn racers to be signed on. And perhaps Tost would be right. With a year's worth of experience behind him, the new addition of slick tyres to F1, which Tost hoped would suit his driving style, and a hopefully fairer balance of teammate in the opposite car, we'd get to see the ChampCar Bourdais begin to emerge. Sadly, the exciting dramas of the pre-season were about as exciting as life would get for Bourdais that year. Previously, Australia had served up the 1-2 double of a dreadful qualifying, but points on race day, and Bourdais saw no reason to break that streak for 2009. The difference was no fairy tale run into the very upper echelons of the points this time. Dead last in qualifying, Bourdais was very much the dictionary definition of scraping into the points, as he took the last point on offer after Hamilton had been disqualified, and crucially, finishing behind Buemi too. As with last year, there was another pause to points hauls, and it took another 5 races for Sebastien to score again, another solitary point in Monaco. It was an impressive effort, having started 14th and running an ultra-long first stint. Bahrain too was a solid showing, not on the surface appearance qualifying last and only finishing 13th, but he put down some solid laps with a 9th fastest lap time, a second quicker than Buemi managed. Bourdais declared that had we started further up, we could have done something pretty good. If waxing lyrical about a 13th place finish sounds like I'm scraping the barrel for positive things to discuss regarding Bourdais' 2009, you'd be correct. For sadly much of that anonymous and unimpressive form from 2008 seemed to duplicate itself across the majority of 2009. Rainy races in Malaysia and China failed to bring home any more points. After finishing 11th in Shanghai with 2 spins to boot, Bourdais grumbled that the race should have been called off. Yet that same day, Buemi took another point. There were messy collisions in Britain and in Spain, from which some Spider-Man-esque pointing emerged when attributing blame, and most fingers seemed to be gesticulating at the Frenchman. A lot of that obscurity and instant magnetism came as fallout from a dreadful run of qualifying form. Only twice all year did he make it out of Q1, thus leaving him mired at the back, either fueled heavy to attempt to make progress or stuck in traffic. If you had a nickel for every time Bourdais outqualified Buemi, you'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Ascanelli claimed this showed Bourdais was not trying to go to the limit to improve himself, and that this subsequently undermined the confidence of the team. It seemed to many that it was a question of when and not if Bourdais would be given his marching orders. Germany was perhaps the nadir of the year. Last in qualifying for the 4th time in 9 races, this time over a second away from the next man up. The resulting race saw him trundle toward the rear for 18 laps before parking up with hydraulic issues. As he trudged across the pit wall, many around the world openly questioned whether this was the end for Sebastien Bourdais. 4 days later, he was sacked. Though there was a brief bit of legal wrangling, the matter was settled with a $2.1 million payment to Bourdais, and so out went the Frenchman and in came the then youngest ever driver in F1, Jaime Alguersuari. Despite his inexperience, Alguersuari's level-headed approach impressed, though he never troubled the scorers that year as Toro Rosso wound up bottom of the constructors' table. Amazingly, Bourdais was nearly back on the grid within a couple of races and in a spot a lot further up the field. When Felipe Massa was ruled out for the remainder of the year after his horror accident in Hungary, Bourdais was one of a number of names linked to the Ferrari seats, though, in his own words, the list was like 30 drivers long. If you name them all, of course you can be in it. Still, despite his struggles, it wasn't the worst shout in the world. If you ran through a checklist of requirements for that seat, Bourdais had recent F1 experience, familiarity with Ferrari power, and connections to the team through Nicholas Todd. Apparently, Todd held discussions with Principal Stefano Domenicali, but in the end, the team opted to look elsewhere. As Bourdais put it, it was very difficult for Ferrari to justify taking a guy who had been fired by Toro Rosso. Perhaps with a fraction more luck the previous year, Bourdais could have been a more serious candidate for that Ferrari drive. He certainly couldn't have done worse than eventual replacement Luca Badoer, but given the struggles of Ferrari's other replacement Giancarlo Fisichella, it's unlikely he could have done much with that opportunity, bar the honour of squiggling former Ferrari driver into his Twitter bio. Bourdais described the year as not a lot of fun, which would be putting it lightly. It'd also be putting it a lot politer than most others would. Ascanelli, so critical of Bourdais' signing 2 years ago, failed to pull his punches. He didn't do for us what was reasonable to expect of him. Martin Brundle admitted he expected more from Bourdais, given that occasionally he was every bit as fast as Vettel in 2008. He hasn't stepped up as a leader, said Brundle, and to my utter amazement, he has allowed a rookie to outperform him. His demolition at the hands of Buemi was perhaps the biggest shock of the year, not just for the fact that many hoped Bourdais would step up his game in 2009, but given that whilst Buemi may well have gone on to achieve a plethora of success in WEC and Formula E, his time in F1 hardly spoke of the next coming of Vettel, making this particular teammate comparison all the more galling. Quite why that was the case seemed to come down once more to the car. Bourdais described the STR4 as pretty much the same as last year, except we struggled for grip because there was less aero on the car and we couldn't get the tyres started. Even in Monaco, home of his last points, Bourdais admitted the car had no stability and that he just missed stuffing it about 50 times. As with the previous year, those excuses can only hold up for so long, again bearing in mind Bourdais' self-proclaimed ease at transferring between different motorsport disciplines, and the distinct lack of as many struggles on the opposite side of the garage from a man called Sebastien. The best drivers will always find a way to adapt their driving styles to work around and fix the inherent issues of a car. Bourdais has claimed that he was never provided the opportunity to do so, stating, "They don't need drivers telling them I need the car to do this or that. They just need a driver who gets in there and pulls the maximum potential out of it." For whatever the reason, though, Bourdais could not find that potential. It meant that was it for Bourdais in F1. If there had been minimal clamour from other teams for his signature before his infamous run of 27 Grand Prix, the resulting noise was now deathly silent. So Bourdais limped away to race in Super League Formula, a short-lived novelty series where cars were sponsored by football clubs, no really, and won a few races for the likes of Sevilla and Lyon, no still really. Since 1999, he's been an ever-present at the Le Mans 24 Hours, but whilst he's been a winner in the GTE Pro class in 2016, his best result remains a trio of second places during his time as a Peugeot factory driver, coming within a lap of victory in 2009 and being cruelly denied a stint in the 2010 pole-sitting Peugeot when it suffered some early suspension issues. It came as little surprise that in 2011, Bourdais returned to America to lick his wounds. By 2013, he was back on the podium once more, and a year later, he returned to the top step of the podium. The wins kept trickling through, including a dominant win in Milwaukee, where he lapped the entire field. In 2017, another win had propelled him to the top of the standings after the first 3 races, but a horrific crash during qualifying for the Indy 500 shattered his pelvis and left him out of racing for the majority of the season. Though he returned later that year, the star of Sebastian was beginning to wane, and though he took one last win in 2018, by the end of the next year he was out of a full-time drive. At the end of 2021, Bourdais announced his departure from IndyCar and went off to focus on sports cars, where he's still churning out the wins. If we're looking for a one-word summary to the ballad of Sebastien Bourdais, it's luck. For many, the obvious starting point is 2008, a smashed mirror's worth of bad luck and misfortune. Few can argue that Bourdais was nothing but a blameless party in watching so many points disappear down the drain thanks to mechanical maladies, strategic slumps and some problematic penalties. The addition of 20 extra points wouldn't have fully papered over the cracks of his struggles with the car or total demolition at the hands of Vettel, but it would have made his campaign appear more capable, more deserving of a second chance. Perhaps with a better standing in the paddock, Bourdais might have been in prime position for a move elsewhere when the musical chair session for 2010 began, with drives available at the likes of Renault or Williams. It may be a harsh statement to make, but perhaps that torrent of trials was simply a case of the universe balancing itself out, given the outrageously good fortune that came his way to open up the door into F1. To briefly stop and consider it, it owed a lot to so many things turning in his favour and, retrospectively, was quite a bizarre choice. His championing as the next great French hope by Todd came in part due to the lack of alternatives at the time, with no real standout candidates anywhere, and others that may have been a more relevant prospect, a young Romain Grosjean for instance, being just a year out of the loop to be picked up. The Toro Rosso vacancy too, in a way, owed a bit to fortune. Yes, perhaps he'd shown a fair turn of speed during his test sessions, but it being in comparison to Messrs Liuzzi and Speed. Talented fellows, but neither of whom ever truly gleamed, let alone shone in the big leagues. Lucky then that Vettel was testing elsewhere at the time for fear of being blown out of the water before even starting a Grand Prix. Justifying his selection there is questionable. Toro Rosso wanted an experienced head, someone to work with the younger talents and move the team forward, but at the time there was no one with F1 experience who fit that bill. Drivers of that ilk on the market consisted of either underwhelming choices, the likes of Montagny or Tiago Montero, or drivers who were, if not over the hill, then certainly beginning a rapid descent to the bottom of it, your Ralf Schumachers or Jacques Villeneuves, neither of whom would have seen the appeal of going from Grand Prix winners to scrabbling for points in an only recently rebranded Minardi outfit. With no other candidates who one could label as experienced, Bourdais was miraculously the only choice remaining. Yet calling Bourdais experienced is a generous adjective. Racing-wise, absolutely, but in F1 circles, not at all. Technically speaking, even someone like Sakon Yamamoto had more F1 mileage under his belt at the time. Was the team's insistence on an experienced head in part due to a lack of younger talents available? That was yet another touch of luck for Sebastien, for the Red Bull Junior production line had effectively seized up at this point, leaving no candidates to sprout from there either. Casting an eye over those in the junior lineup, we can find names like Buemi, Brendan Hartley, Robert Wickens, Karun Chandhok, Jaime Alguersuari, all promising talents at one point, but either thoroughly underwhelming or still a little too junior to be seriously considered for a promotion all the way into F1 then. Yet as favoured fortune might have been in opening up that path into F1, the monkey's paw-esque caveat around it was the exact seat that was provided to him. A Toro Rosso seat, a seat that is, and always has been, one for younger talents. Was it therefore simply a stopgap role until one of the preferred juniors was deemed good enough for a promotion? That much was clear given the consensus that here was a team built around Vettel even as early as the 2008 Spanish Grand Prix. Helmut Marko was already singing the young German's praises and as good as confirmed that Vettel would be promoted into Red Bull for 2009. For Bourdais, there was no such praise, no such hints at better things to come. A Toro Rosso seat was in actuality a lose-lose scenario. There was little to no prospect of a promotion, and the chances of finding a seat elsewhere, under the pressure of needing to immediately perform in a new environment, were just as slim. That much is clear in the deafening silence from any other parties both before and after his eventual F1 sojourn. Many will be happy to gesture at his car struggles in both of his seasons, delighted to pin it alongside the so many others who have failed to make a bridge between America and F1. And that may be true, but we can argue that it never should have been that way. It would be remiss not to mention the lost opportunity with Arrows, admittedly neither a stable nor speedy operation at the time, but a seat in F1 for Bourdais at a time when he was still at his most honed in perhaps. A strong performance in a backmarker car could have still presented better opportunities in 2003. Just see Justin Wilson, who Bourdais handily beat in America, who graduated from Minardi to Jaguar mid-season. Sadly, talented drivers missing out on seats owing to finances, whether their own or otherwise, is part and parcel of F1. What that did mean, though, was a long sojourn away from Europe into American racing, and thus the resulting struggles with the car upon his return. How much better could Bourdais have been still dialed into the world of Formula racing than long since attuned to the American model? Would he have proved a closer match for Vettel, shown more of those flashes of promise? It's a flimsy argument, as the world's best drivers know how to adapt from one specification to another, but it was nevertheless an unfortunate and unhelpful series of circumstances. The flip side of that argument is that maybe Bourdais wasn't that good and that's why he struggled so. Establishing that is tricky. We don't have any reliable parameters for judging his talent. His CV may come with Formula 3000 champion attached to it, but looking at those he beat to the title, the likes of Pantano and Enge, neither of whom ever showed much in their brief tenures in F1, casts doubt over just how strong such a field was and thus how valuable such a title is. Many will argue a similar thing with his ChampCar legacy. There can be no questioning over his domination there, but many will query again the value of such titles in a series that was slowly stuttering on its final legs. Conversely, he entered F1 at a hyper-competitive point in time, wherein the margins between first and last grew slimmer, and his rivals consisted of 6 past and future champions plus 8 race winners. For this old chicane, perhaps the worst luck was that it was F1 where Bourdais had unfinished business, where an itch to race festered within him. Miss a shot in Formula E? That's okay. IndyCar? Not so bad. But this is F1, a brand synonymous with being the pinnacle of motorsport, even if many nowadays will argue a case against that. At the time of writing, I'm working on a script regarding Michael Schumacher and Mercedes, and there's a great quote from Martin Brundle who says, "I would drive a car tomorrow if they gave me a chance, and I'm 53. Saying no to F1 when everything and anyone might scream at such a poor career choice is easier said than done. Not many are blessed with the luck of a strong enough willpower to recognise that. As of 2023, Sebastien Bourdais remains the most recent driver to have transferred to F1 from American racing. Though his experiences seem to simultaneously deter others from trying the same, as well as burning all and any bridges between the two bodies, there's now a growing sense that perhaps enough time has passed to salve those wounds. And as the sport's popularity continues to grow stateside, the likes of Colton Herta and Alex Palau are starting to peek across the pond and wonder whether maybe, just maybe, this time, they'll be the lucky one. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.